In my dream, I see my brothers turn a corner across the road. I wake up sobbing and tell you about it. Then I wake up shaken and tell you my dream about waking up sobbing after dreaming that Barry and Owen had turned a corner. Hi there, my name's Stuart Ross, and this is my weekly live stream called Razovskyville. And thanks for joining me. I know there's so much going on today, so I'm grateful for those of you who are joining me here. Um, Also, there's a little thing there where you can, I think up on the right, where you can invite friends who might be interested in my writing, joining this live stream. So please invite them if you think they might enjoy it. So I read that poem at the top and showed you a photo. I'll show you that photo again. That is from, I believe, your left to right, maybe. Anyway, the tallest boy there is my brother Barry. I'm the little baby, and the other boy is my brother Owen. My brother Barry died Monday night. Suddenly, 12:30 on Monday night, and so I want to dedicate this edition of Razovskyville to my brother Barry Neil Ross, the memory of my brother Barry Neil Ross. He was a great guy, and he did some writing, and he wrote some crazy rhyming poems. And you can read a little bit about him on my blog, blogamuga.blogspot.ca, so check that out. I'm going to tell you, before I sort of get to the main focus of today's show, first of all, I'm a little apologetic. I'm a little tired, and I may be a little rambly because I haven't slept a lot this week as a result of what's been going on. Anyway, Razovskyville. I call it Razovskyville because my family's name was Razovsky. My father's father, who came from Russia, was Max Razovsky. I married a woman, Sarah, who became Sarah Razovsky, and we became Rosses. I think that after my dad came along sometime in the 50s, he came along in the 20s, but a few decades later they changed their name to Ross because Ross was probably a better name to have at that time. There's a lot of anti-Semitism going on. They felt it would make things simpler, but wow, I really, really love the name Razovsky and always wish I was Razovsky. Hi there, Nick, and hi there, Pablo, all the way from Argentina. It's good to see you. Hey, Ben and Anne. Thanks those of you joining in. Okay, so again, this show in memory of my dear brother Barry. I talked a little bit last week about various of my publications from the early 90s, and I read you some of a poem called Ladies and Gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget, and then I directed you to see the song version on YouTube, but there is a much better way for you to hear that and to get that song. As I mentioned, that song is on this CD called An Orphan Song. I'm going to play it for you right now, the opening, or not the opening, it's the second track here, Ladies and Gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. So this is a song that a dear friend of mine, Ben Walker, who is a fabulous singer, songwriter, performer, he adapted 15 of my poems, unbeknownst to me, to songs. And then later on, we released them jointly as this CD, An Orphan Song. And Ron Paget, as I've mentioned in the past, is like a great hero of mine, a great poetry hero of mine, a New York poet, second generation New York poet, a really, really nice fellow. But before I'd ever met him, I had this sort of imagining of what it would be to meet Ron Paget in person. So I'm going to play you the track. I think the sound should be pretty good. This is Ben Walker, adaptation of my 10-part poem into just like a 4-minute song. So Ben Walker singing Ladies and Gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. Though I see that my stereo's gone off, so this is taking me a moment here. Here it comes any moment now. Please talk amongst yourselves. Invite your friends to join us. Here we go. Ben Walker.
I got depressed on the subway. I was reading your stuff. I started sweating and I fell to my knees, because I wished I had written all of that. I banged my head on the subway floor. It went down, thud, down, thud, down. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. You're not Ron Justine, who I met in first year. You're not Ron Stewart, the hockey player. You're not Ron Ross, my cousin in Los Angeles. You're not Ron Madison, my oldest brother's friend. You're not the movie star Ron Ely. He played Tarzan, but he always seemed a bit too old. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. Mr. Ron Paget from Tulsa, Oklahoma, born 1942 during the war. Ron remembers John F. Kennedy's death, remembers Robert Kennedy's death. Ron has a wife and son. Ron writes, Ron teaches, Ron translates. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. What a lousy bunch of words, Ron. Not an image among them. I'm really sorry I buggered things up. You're on to me now. Stand up, Ron, reach across the border. Give me a slap in the face. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. Okay, let's pretend I'm meeting Ron. We'll meet at Toby's Hamburgers. Ron would have popularity, which has mushrooms. And I get the truck stop. He'd offer to pay, then I'd say no. Then find I left my wallet at home. The waitress would say, don't worry about it. And everyone would turn their heads. And she'd say, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget.
So that was Ben Walker, my dear friend Ben Walker, singing the song that he adapted from my long poem, Ladies and Gentlemen, Mr. Ron Paget. And you can get a copy of that CD if you check out benwalkersongs.com. That's benwalkersongs.com. And I think you can get a digital copy of it on Spotify as well. And it's a really wonderful CD, and I'm completely unbiased. So I just want to mention that a couple of people have showed up here. Marilyn Karp, if I remember way back from Bathurst Manor, I believe Marilyn dated my brother Barry, to whom this show is dedicated tonight. And it's so great. I remember you so well, Marilyn, and thank you for being here. And then Michelle Rosen, who lived across the road from me, right there on Panny Hill Road, a street I've written a lot about, and a neighborhood I've written a lot about in novels and stories and poems. And it's amazing that you joined us here, Michelle. Thank you. Hi to Stephen, and hi to Lauren, and Marilyn was on Panny Hill as well. I didn't remember that. Okay. Wow. This is like a Panny Hill reunion we've got going on here. This is awesome. It's really nice. Sorry. It's really nice on this particular day to have people from where Barry and Owen and I grew up. Okay. What I was going to talk about mainly, was my first book of poetry. I've read from chapbooks, various chapbooks, and odd little leaflets and other publications of mine on previous Razovskyvilles. And today I decided I was going to read from something that's very special in every poet's life, which is their first book of poetry. And first books of poetry in the 50s, 60s, 70s, very different, I think, in many ways from first books of poetry now. What's exciting, what to me can be really exciting about a first book of poetry, is they're crazy, they're unstructured, they're eclectic. They might be poems that were written over a period of 10, 15, 20 years, or maybe just a few years, but they're written at a time when poets are trying all these different kind of things. And I can't even remember the specific story behind this book. It's called The Inspiration Cha-Cha. It's published in 1996 by ECW Press, and I don't recall how I got to ECW Press with that book, what it was that attracted me about ECW, but it was the best decision I ever made, probably. They were wonderful to work with, and the book showed up. We had the launch at the Rivoli, and the book showed up 10 minutes before the launch. It showed up from the printer 10 minutes before the launch was to begin. So there was incredible suspense going on. The editor at the time was Michael Holmes, who I knew somewhat. Maybe he had asked me. He's a very fine poet, great editor. And maybe he asked me. I was a little off-put because he said you were like the clown prince of Canadian poetry or something. And I didn't like being thought of as a humorous poet. I always took my poetry pretty seriously. And often at readings, people would laugh at things that I thought were pretty serious, but I know somehow that a lot of my stuff's pretty goofy, so that is true. Look, let's see. So I'm going to read you from this book, and I'm going to talk a bit about first books. If any of you out there are thinking of assembling a first book of poetry, this is my advice. Do not worry if the poems fit together. They fit together because they were all written by you, and if it's a crazy, eclectic mishmash, to me, that's the most exciting kind of book of poetry. Okay, so here goes. I'm just going to start off with the first poem in my first full-length book of poetry, The Inspiration Cha-Cha. I have something to tell you. I've come to talk to you about shaving cuts. I was waiting across the road right over there for the light to turn, and you were on the other side, fumbling with change at the newspaper box. Don't buy this one. Buy this one, I said, pointing to identical newspapers. Look here, I cut myself self-shaving. Both my hands are cameras. Do you think that's why I can't hold a razor? My feet, too, are cameras, and my belly made round by beer, that's a camera, too. A big camera. Each of my eyes, they're cameras. They work good in the dark. And my mouth, well, it's not a camera. But when it opens, out comes my tongue, an actual camera. Some people have cameras mounted on each shoulder, but each of my shoulders is a camera, or each are a camera, grammar not being my strong suit. And speaking of suits, look what I'd done to this one this morning. I was shaving. Dad said shave before you get dressed, right after you shower, while your face is soft. But always the rebel, I showered, got dressed, then shaved. And look what I've done to my suit. Of course, it's hard holding razors, no matter how soft your face is, when your hands are cameras. Have I told you about my hands? So that's the first poem of mine that ever appeared in a proper book of mine. That was all my book. And that was the first one. By the way, if you have any questions as I'm going along, any kind of questions, I am really into some interaction here, and I would love to I would love to hear from you. And I also want to say hello to Catherine in Montreal, who is a very, very dear friend and a collaborator on many present projects and past projects and future projects, and a fantastic person and a fantastic poet herself. I worked for a while, as I probably told you last week, at Harlequin. I read 200 Harlequin romance novels over a period of 3.5 years, first as a proofreader and then as a copy editor. There was this one guy, and his name was Charles. I don't remember his last name, but maybe I shouldn't say it anyway. He was an older guy who worked there, and a real oddball, quirky guy. And Charles used to show up, like we were to start work at 9. He would show up every morning, I don't know, an hour or more earlier. And he would just chain smoke and walk around and around and around the building until everyone else came. And I don't know if that was to get away from his family earlier in the morning or what he was doing about that. But I decided I would write a poem, and it's really about the Harlequin building, which was at that time on Les Mill Road and Don Mills in Toronto. It's called Around the Building. From across the road, I peer at the building. It is gray. It rises 9 floors. I work in it. I work 5 floors up. My watch tells me it is 7 a.m. At 8:30, I will be at my desk, and I will take the top sheet from a pile of papers, and I will scrape specks with a special little knife. It is my special little knife, and not one defect will go by unscraped. I am the best in the world at this, but now it is 7:02, and I cross the road and approach the glass doors. I light a cigarette like I do every morning at 7:02, then I light another, jam another in my mouth, and another. I walk to the left, to the edge of the building, and I turn the corner. I walk to the back of the building, and I turn the corner. I walk across the back of the building, around the dumpster, then turn the corner. I walk to the front of the building and turn the corner. Soon I am at the entrance again. I look at my watch. It is 7:09. I walk around the building again. It is 7:17. A bird smashes into a 3rd floor window and falls to my feet. I place it in my pocket and circle the building. It's a different bird from yesterday. My pocket is getting full. I smoke and I walk and I trace my hand around the brick. This building contains me, contains my thoughts. This building contains my desk and my phone, my special little knife, my cubicle. I smoke and I walk faster, and the traffic grows. My coworkers begin to arrive, slipping silently through the door. I walk around the building. It is 8:26. In 4 minutes, I will be at my desk, clutching my knife. In 4 minutes, I will know what to do. That's a little bit what it was like to work at Harlequin Romance novel publishing place in the early 1990s. One of the things we had to do as proofreaders is once they printed out the proofs, there sometimes would be little tiny inkjet specks on it, and we would have to sit there with an X-Acto knife and scrape off these little dots before it went to press. Unbelievable that we spent a time doing that. Oh my gosh, Anita from Harlequin is here. In fact, Anita, this is so great to see you here. Anita, very, very fine friend from Harlequin. We went to see Public Image Limited together, and maybe the best concert of my life. And it's really, really nice to see you, Anita. Thanks for joining us. Charles George. No, Charles George. The guy Charles, thank you so much, Ben. Ben just reminded me, like, the guy named Charles who waited and smoked. I don't remember what his last name was, but this cover is by Charles George. And I was so thrilled. I've been really lucky with all my books but one to have an artist friend or a designer do the cover. And this is the first one. It's a painting made specifically for this. And I just really wanted for this book that there be no typography on it, that everything would be hand done. And Charles did this painting. And it's one of the craziest book covers. And it's a crazy title too, The Inspiration Cha-Cha. And Charles George, who was from Ontario, was living on Queen Street West at the time, and now lives in Brooklyn, I think. Works for some newspapers, does illustration. He's illustrated some children's books. Brilliant, brilliant artist. Okay, I'm babbling here. And Charlie Huskin, speaking of Charles's, Charlie Huskin, who ran the St. Rosedale Library and is a cultural icon of Toronto and one of the goodest people upon the earth, and possibly the most fascinating conversationalist is here. And I'm really, really glad to see you, Charlie. Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm feeling very moved to have a lot of really good friends here on a difficult week. Thank you for those of you who are here. And sometimes your comments skip right by, and I don't get to see you're here, but I wish I could say hello and introduce every one of you to each other. So I'm going to read you another poem here. Oh, I was going to get a little prop for this one. Okay, you talk among yourself literally for 20 seconds. I might be able to find the prop quickly. Okay, sorry, no, can't find it. But if I find it next week, I will. Mark Lab and Mark was another childhood friend who lived on Panna Hill Road, and he and I were collaborators since we were 4 or 5 years old. I talked about him a few episodes ago of Razovskyville, and we had this poem where we would we'd wear cardboard boxes on our head, and we'd have a little toilet paper, toilet paper roll for our eyes, and then we'd have a paper towel roll for our mouth tube, and one eye tube. And we'd come out there and we walk out onto the stage, and we had ping pong balls in the mouth tubes. And then we'd walk on the stage, these two guys with cardboard boxes on their head. And I can't find my cardboard box right now, but it's in that room with 60 boxes of stuff I haven't unpacked since I moved to Coburg 10 years ago. And Jesus Christ, I'm babbling. So we would walk out and we would stand there very formally, and then we would launch ping pong balls out of our mouth tubes. And then we would begin this poem, which is called Boxhead. And we do other things, but this is one of the ones that I wrote for us. I love hang gliding. I really love hang gliding. Do you like hang gliding? Whoosh! I love fried fish. Does Tom eat fried fish? Take off the fins first, Tom. Look at the dogs in the window. See how many there are? Hear them bark. The world is so big, it is a big village. They have TV there. Let's go sometime, huh? Someone told me about someone important. They have their picture on money also. They sit in the back and someone drives their car. Mary plays tag with the children. How many children do you have? I have no children. They're too small. Now I will dance for you. I've changed my mind. Whoops! Somebody just disappeared. I think that this poem, either I took all of the text or much of the text, or I was inspired by like English language instruction books. And my brother Barry, by the way, was an instructor. He was an ESL teacher, and he taught English grammar to people whose first language wasn't English. And he also taught English pronunciation, and he phoned me up constantly to tell me all these incredible little things he'd heard about, he discovered about grammar and about English pronunciation and inflection. And that was in the last, 5 or 6 years of his life. And that really bonded us a lot because I was into that stuff. And it was great to have something that we were really both interested in, because he was really into sports, which I wasn't. Anyway, my brother Barry. So anyway, that's Boxhead. Do we have any questions here? Let me just see. Marilyn says, hearing your writing, I would say Barry lives within you too. And it's really nice. Okay, sorry. Emotional. You know what? At this emotional moment would be the best time for me to read this poem. And it's called, I think you'll all be able to relate to this next poem. And I wrote this at a period in North American poetry when language poetry was, something called language poetry was becoming really big. And language poetry was this poetry that rejected narrative and character. It rejected accessibility. And so I thought I would do a sort of a send-up of that kind of poem, not knowing that, in fact, I would eventually write poems like that sort of seriously. So this was my poem. And it was called, I Think You'll All Be Able to Relate to This Next Poem. Carbuncular autopsy, the of brain spasm, towards fix-it, muffin, of my eclipsed veranda amoeba, she a glimpse, not each what, carburetor potato, the it mojo. So honestly, in that era and to this day, poems just like that get published all over the place, and people win awards. It's absolutely incredible. And so that was my introduction to language poetry. I'm going to mention this once, and I haven't mentioned it yet, and I'll just mention it this one time, just in case. People have a lot of things going on, and a lot of people are really unemployed, and a lot of people have to watch their money. But if you're not among those people, you are welcome to send me a little tip. There's a little paypal.me/Razovsky. I think that should be visible there. Paypal.me/Razovsky. And if you want to tip me for this, you're welcome to, okay? Because writers actually have to make a living. This is me making a living. Oh my God, my parents would have been horrified. Okay, here's a poem called Things I Can't Quite Believe. See if there are any questions here. No questions. Okay. Things I can't quite believe. I was talking to the secretary. I'm going to start again. I was talking to the Secretary of the Interior the other day, the Chief of Police, the leader of the official opposition, the guy who empties out the wastebaskets, a couple of blind ranch hands, a woman who wrote a book that nobody read, Ralph Bellamy, dead. I said, I look into the sky, see blinking lights moving through clouds, and try to catch one in a jar, like we did, my brother and I, with fireflies in New Jersey. And in the morning, I look at the jar on my desk, and it contains a plane, an airplane, little people clawing at the windows, the ebbing buzz of a dying engine. I hear my mother's footsteps coming down the hallway, grab the jar and shove it under my bed. This is just one of the tales, one of the fables I tell, a story, a legend. Some call it a yarn, a bald-faced lie, a whisper, and a prayer. Oh, I do so want to be a poet, Mr. O'Hara. Make me a poet. Make me be one. So those of you who are not necessarily familiar with contemporary poetry, Mr. O'Hara was a reference to a great New York poet named Frank O'Hara. Died in, I think, 1966. Wrote Meditations in Emergency and lunch poems, and was one of the first poets to just do poems about walking down the street and what he saw and what newspaper he bought and what he bought for lunch, and he made incredible poetry of that. You know what I'm going to do before I read the next couple? Okay, first person who wants, if you give me a page number, I will just read them. I haven't read these poems in so long, and I can't really decide what to read, so give me a page number, and I'll read the poem on that page, maybe. So that page would be somewhere between, it goes up to page 104 of this book, and I'm saving 104 for the ending of my reading here. So any page number you want me to read? Anyone? Starts on page 8, goes to 104. Charlie, you are such a great supporter. Thank you. I appreciate it. No one wants to hear any particular page. Okay, I'll just keep going on with my plan. So here's a very tiny poem. Oh, Charlie asked for a page. I'm going to go to that page in a moment. Wow, that's a depressing poem. Okay, first I'm going to read this little tiny poem called Poem. This is very profound. Poem. A half-eaten hamburger. A broken rubber band. The inside of my shoe. So I think my theory there was you just take three completely unrelated things and you put them together as a poem, and people will draw connections between them, maybe. Or maybe I didn't even think that far. I just thought of three stupid things, put them in, and called it poem. I'm going to read page 70, which Charlie asked for. It's a little bit of a grim poem, but let's give it a try. I haven't read this in however long. This book came out in 1996, so I haven't read it in probably 20-something years. It's called An Underwater Adventure. The face was twisted ice. Bubbles streamed from the nostrils. On his watch, a cartoon mouse raced slowly through time. 2 hours earlier, the burgers had tasted just right. The sun was shining, the children's shouts comforting. 4 months earlier, the postman got the mail to all the right houses, did his job well, and even then he knew that water might someday fill his lungs. He fed his dog, trimmed his sideburns, listened to 40s swing, watched baseball whenever he... As a child, he ran through the sprinkler, his brother chasing, swinging a bat. Stitches once held his left eye shut, and sometimes he got the Buffalo station so clearly that... What were the last things he said, the last things he wrote? People would rack their memories, repeat, distort, read much into every word. But he could still think. Tiny sea creatures he couldn't name bounced against his bulging eyes. His knees were rippling and his toes bobbed on the sandy bottom. An actual alligator came out of nowhere and stared right at him. His mouth, which opened and closed from time to time, became filled with fish, and seaweed grew between his teeth. Once, when he was trying to remember a chewing gum jingle, a hook with a bloated worm drifted past, taking a bit of his ear. The fish that swam within him, meanwhile, were attracted to the light that entered through his eyes. They swam further into his head, propelling him forward and towards the surface. Jesus, this is weird, he thought, his arms dragging along at his sides. Here I am, floating dead down a river, little fishies in my head, and elsewhere, men and women are getting their heads kicked in. Does anyone have any comments on that poem? I think it's a pretty good poem. It's pretty devastating. Thank you, Charlie, for guessing page 70. We've had a request from Catherine Cormier-Larose for page 39. Let us just see what's going on there. That's actually the last page of a long poem that I read last week, so I'm not going to read that one, but thanks anyway. Kate Sutherland, author of How to Draw a Rhinoceros, asks for page 17. And page 17 is the third page of a long poem that I read last week, because I was reading all these chapbooks, and all these chapbooks ended up in my big book. So I'm sorry to turn y'all down here. Melissa Marshall asks for page 25. Melissa, what do we have? We have a third... I'm not going to read anything that anyone asked for. It's the second page of a 3-page sequence of poems about the serial killer John Wayne Gacy. And I just don't feel like reading it. I think it's a good poem, though. I don't think I'll ever read that aloud again. So Ben Walker says page 77. Let's see what reason I have to reject that. Okay, I don't have any reason. Oh man, what is this one? I think it might be another depressing poem, but let's see what happens. It's called The Clamor. Was like a little Nosferatu village, everyone running around with coffins tucked beneath their arms, scurrying and seething in fast motion, like frames were missing between their movements, maybe some kind of crazed ant colony. You blink and suddenly there's twice the insects, like so much lava, climbing over one another, moving in barely recognizable chains with brains so small they feared not the big foot. Lisa turned to me and said, "Call me Lisa." And I was just agape. How can you even think of that at a time like this? We're in some kind of emergency. We huddled in the doorway of an abandoned shoe store, and the din was so dense you could cut it with maybe a petrified ear, but a normal ear, all fleshy and soft? No way. A man held a long stick high above the crowd, a poodle tied to it, blindfolded, a ribbon in each ear. "I've got my own problems without all this shit," I told Lisa. She put her hand to my brow and told me I had a fever, to calm down, to go with the flow. A flailing woman just then was passed over the heads of the rampaging mob, and I nearly swallowed my teeth. "I once loved her," I called, pointing, "or someone just like her." Feeling suddenly dizzy, I sunk to the ground, and the crash and the wheeze of the crowd churned in my stomach, and my gut was a lost sailor in a black raincoat and a 4-day beard, slashing at an entire raging ocean with a weather-beaten oar and curses the size of the whole grinning sky. So this is what happens when you grow up in the 1960s in a nice little Jewish neighborhood in suburban Toronto. You write crazy surrealist poetry. And Mark Laba was on my street too, and he writes even crazier surrealist poetry. So there you go. Pablo Petkovicek from Argentina said they published a book by Frank O'Hara last year in Spanish, and they is Socios Fundadores. I hope I got that right, Pablo. And they're publishing a chapbook of mine, which, by the way, I was supposed to say, I was supposed to get back to you about the contract. I like everything in the contract. It's great with the feedback that I gave you before. And sorry, I'm doing a little business here, folks. And then it was something about public. I just am agreeing to have it printed in the publications that you publish. So I would prefer if the English didn't appear published anywhere else by anyone else. So I hope that was clear. So that's going to come out soon, and I'll let you know. And those of you, my Spanish-speaking friends here in Canada and the States, can also buy copies of my book, which I don't even remember the title of it in Spanish. Anita asked for page 10, and I'm just going to read a couple more poems here, and then I'm going to talk a little bit, and I'm going to rant a little. Page 10. More people are killed in car accidents. A boy boards a plane. It looks both ways and takes off. In the rear of the plane, an infant wails. An attendant demonstrates the proper use of the oxygen mask, points out the exits, fastens a seatbelt, unfastens it. She buckles and ties a life preserver, then tugs a cord that turns on a light. The boy is seated beside pig farmers. He learns much about slop drainage. These are lessons he will not soon forget. Dinner comes on a plastic tray. The woman pig farmer offers the boy her after-dinner mint. He declines. The plane lands and the boy disembarks. His knees are shaking and his heart kicks like a baby. He is in England. He is at an airport in England. 3 weeks pass. He goes home. That was more people are killed in car accidents. It's about these things that were these long, they were like metal tubes with like sticks coming out the sides, and they used to fly through the air and take people all over the world. I don't know how many of you remember those. It's a long time ago. Oh my gosh, hey, Brian Smith, fabulous teacher. I mentioned him before. He's been here before, from Woodstock, who brought me in to speak to his students, some of whom I met in later years, and said Brian Smith was an amazing, energetic teacher. He wrote here, poetry that rejects narrative is working very hard against what Margaret Atwood describes as a human impulse of the first order. I would tell you a story about it. I would like to hear that story. I see that that's poetry rejecting narrative. It's interesting because Margaret Atwood is arguably a feminist. Some would say she's not a feminist, but the language poetry that rejected narrative saw narrative as a patriarchal construct. As I start talking now, I'm going to see all the numbers of people here go down until there's no one left here. Anyway, and they saw it as a patriarchal capitalist construct. And so that was one of the reasons they decided to reject narrative, reject sentiment, reject characters, and just do a poetry that didn't fit into the kinds of stories that capitalism would tell us to keep us under control, I think. Anyway, but thank you, Brian. That's an amazing, we've now had a serious conversation on a Razovskyville. I don't know if it's ever happened before. There's one more page number, and then I'm going to finish off my reading and just talk a little bit more about stuff and answer any questions. Allie asks for page 92. Page 92 is the second page of a 13-part poem of mine called Paralysis Beach, which was originally published as a chapbook by the Pink Dog Press, which was run by Kevin Connolly. It was great. He was going to make a special edition with with sandpaper on the front covers, and it never came to pass. But it's a lovely little chapbook, and I will read. What I'm actually going to do is I'm going to read two of the sections. I'm going to read actually page 91 and 92 just to give you a little flavor of that long sequence, because it was also inspired by a childhood thing, which was my friend Mark Laba used to go with his family to Crystal Beach, which I never went to. His family used to go to Crystal Beach, and a lot of the Jews in Bathurst Manor, they went to Crystal Beach. I don't even know where that is. If anyone knows, maybe you could write it there. Um, and uh, and I just always had these imaginings of what Crystal Beach was like, and I saw it as very sort of scuzzy and scummy and dirty and I don't know. So here's parts 2 and 3 of Paralysis Beach. The hot dog stand is very far away. Hank stands there humming, holding a knife, hand suspended over the mustard. The mustard is good. The buns are good. Hank is patient. He feels deep down that soon, very soon, he'll be visited. Maybe a fat lady in sunglasses, maybe the Pope. Page 92 is part 3. A communist named Norm has an insect up his nose, cannot find the hot dog stand, has a bottle cap impacted in his foot, is scared of water, suspects his wife of infidelities as he wanders the beach, twitching. A ghost hovers over Norm, panting his name on a frequency heard only by surfers. Actually, I'm going to read one more part. Part 4. The hollow restaurant is starting to decay. It's a family sort of place. A former journalist waits on tables, bursts hair on end into the thick kitchen heat. Man, 43, wants soup, seeks side of fries. The chef nods, butts out his cigarette, kicks off his shoes, scratches his ass, and lifts the ladle from the floor. And Marilyn tells me that Crystal Beach was near Buffalo, New York. Thank you for that request, Allie, and thanks for the other requests. I'm going to read one more poem, the last poem in this book, which actually follows Paralysis Beach. I'm going to talk a little bit more. If you have any questions, throw them in. Brian says, the last line sounds like a piece of American news from the last couple of days. Sorry, last couple of weeks. No, whoops, last couple of decades. Shall I try centuries or eons? Thank you very much, Brian. I think you should take over my show. You're brilliant. Okay, this is a poem, a little prose poem called Happy. Oh, I'm going to show you the picture of me on the back. I don't know if you can see it. That's me in a bathrobe and pajamas, because Steve Enright, who came over to do my author photo, he told me what day he was going to come, like a week early, and I can't plan that far ahead, so he knocked at the door at 9 a.m. I answered the door, who the hell is here at 9 a.m., in my pajama and bathrobe, and Steve said, I'm here to take your photo. And we did a whole photo shoot of me in my bathrobe and pajamas. And then I took a shower, got dressed. Then he did another photo shoot where I was wearing a jean jacket and I was lying on the ground and inert. And I think that was on my first book of fiction, Henry Kafka and Other Stories. Okay. There's some amazing conversation, but you can see it all, so I don't need to read it to you. This conversation between Charlie Huskin and Brian Smith. I wish those guys would be in a room talking, because it would be one of the most fascinating, absorbing conversations ever happened. Okay, this is the last poem in the Inspiration Cha-Cha. I gathered you together and provided you with comfortable seats so that I may ask you this question. Did I be happy correctly? Do my smile go on my face right? In the slots on the backs of the seats in front of you, you should find plenty of paper and some pencils, and I ask you to take your time in answering. Did my dog like the way I walked him? Am people in general liking me? Is my niceness genuine in my voice? Am I enjoying life as you had instructed? Please write your answers neatly and hand them to my assistant on your way out the door. And with the last person, please tell the next group I am ready for them. I was pretty proud of that poem. It's one of my many poems that have deliberate, fun grammatical errors. Carol Siblock, hi there. I should mention that I am, in the basement of the home where I live, but this building used to be flamboyant vintage clothing store, and so the flamboyant sign is still there. There's various different things. There's mannequins over there that sometimes freak me out when I come down at night. There's all sorts of interesting costumes around, and it's a fascinating place to be. And some of the leftovers of flamboyant vintage clothing stores are still down here. Um, I'm just going to talk for a moment. I'm going to say this. And hi there, Carol, and thank you for letting me use this place as my studio. Um, you know, I think what started happening in the last 10 or 20 years is because of MFA programs and grants and things, is people started writing books. Almost so many books of poetry now are books that they're projects. They're about one thing, and there's some great books like that. They're project books. There might be a book-length poem, or they're books where all the poems are thematically connected. And I'm a really big fan of poetry books that are really eclectic and crazy and wacky and full of things, and you turn from one page to the next and you have no idea what you're going to see. But I think that when you apply for a grant application, you can't just write, I'm going to write a bunch of poems and put them in a book. That is my project. You're not probably going to get a grant. And then if you get an MFA program, you have into an MFA program, you have to do the trend is towards writing a poem, a book of poems that's about something. I'm really not into aboutness. I'm into aboutlessness. So I'm going to show you a few first books from history, mainly from the 60s and 70s, that I think were really, really interesting. This is a beautiful book by a really great Canadian poet named Victor Coleman, who was way before his time. It's called Old Friends' Ghosts, and it's published, believe it or not, aside from the cover, this is a perfect bound book. It's got a spine and everything. Inside, everything is mimeographed. It's about 60 pages long. Victor Coleman's first book, Old Friends' Ghosts, published by Nelson Ball, who was a really dear friend, an absolute hero of mine, as is Victor. And Nelson published this book through his Wheat Flower Press. And that's Victor Coleman's first book, a mimeographed, perfect bound book. And it's so surprising. From page to page, you don't know what's going to happen. I mentioned Mark Laba before. That's his first book, called Dummy Spit. I went to Mercury Press and said, just let me put out one book by someone. Let me see a book through the press. I wasn't like part of the press. It was Bev Dario running the press. She said, okay, you can do one book. And so in 2002, I harassed Mark Laba until he gave me enough stuff to create this book. The cover design is by Gord Robertson, really beautiful. Sort of pretty cool picture of Mark Laba on the back. And this is one of the craziest and most unexpected books. That's a great first book. Miss Pamela's Mercy is the first book by Lynn Crosby, great Toronto poet. Very controversial, pretty amazing. And that's her first book from Coach House Press. And the year of that book was 1992, and very, very unusual stuff going on there. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a picture of Lynn she's actually across from me in a diner, so I took her author photo for this. This book. There's Lynn Crosby, one of the most brilliant and underrated poets, I think, in this country. Danny Couture, another Toronto poet, originally from Windsor, in 2006, from Peddler Press, put out this book, Good Meat. You do not know what's going to happen from page to page. But going a little bit further back in time, I'm just going to do a little bit more show and tell. Joe Rosenblatt, who was a Toronto poet, moved out west. This is his first book from Coach House Books, and this is from 1966 or something. Let me see. I can't quite find it, but I think it's 1966. It's called The LSD Leacock, and it is absolutely out of this world. Joe Rosenblatt. A little bit more show and tell. One of my favorite poets, as I mentioned to you, is my two big most favorite poets when I was a teenager. Do I have both of their books here? Oh yeah, I do. Okay, so from the United States, remember Ron Padgett from that song at the beginning? This was Ron Padgett's first perfect bound book, Great Balls of Fire, with a fantastic cover by his old buddy from Tulsa, Oklahoma, Joe Brainerd, great artist. Great Balls of Fire You do not know what you're going to see from one page to the next. And really, that's how Ron has continued through his whole career. You just don't know what's going to happen from page to page. And I love books like that. Gorgeous book. What year is that? Great Balls of Fire. It was published by Holt, Reinhardt and Winston, which is like a big publisher. Really weird. 1969, that book. And also another first book by a poet I love. I'm pretty sure this is his first perfect bound full collection. Letters from the Earth to the Earth by David W. McFadden. Dave died, I think, almost 2 years ago, June 2018. He was a really, really great friend, a beloved friend, and I had the privilege of editing his last 6 or 7 books. But when I was a teenager, I found some of his books, and I was blown away by him, and he changed my poetry entirely. So, Letters from the Earth to the Earth, and that's, again, published from Coach House Press in 1968. And if you can get a used copy of that, I highly recommend it. It's a gorgeous thing. A few other interesting things. Tom Walmsley became a dear friend of mine. His first book, Rabies, from Pulp Press, and it was published in, I think, 1976. Again, another shocking book. Anyway, there's a lot of different books here. James Tate, The Lost Pilot, amazing American poet, died about a year ago. The Lost Pilot was his poetry went through so many changes. A beautiful first book. David Berman, his first and only book. He was lead singer of the Silver Jews and did his last album called Purple Mountains, which came out, I think, shortly after he ended his own life. I think it was last summer. He was a brilliant, brilliant poet. In fact, I believe that he studied under James Tate. I might have that wrong. There's a whole bunch of other things here. Elise Friedman, great Toronto poet, only did one book of poetry called Know Your Monkey from ECW Press in what year? 2003. Anyway, there's so many interesting first books, and I'm just going to show you a few that I put through when I was the editor, when I had my imprint at Anvil Press. Nova Scotia Poet, Jamie Forsyth, Sympathy Loophole. Crazy book. It's amazing. That's from Mansfield Press, where I had my imprint. If I said ECW, forgive me. Tara as a Party, another dear friend and great poet. Her only, I think, perfect bound book. It was her first big book. Last Stop, Lonesome Town, which I published through my imprint at Mansfield Press. My imprint was called a Stuart Ross book. Very imaginative title. And At the Gates of the Theme Park by Peter Norman, another poet who's lived all over the place, but he lives on the outskirts of Toronto now. Anyway, Chris Gustafson says, hooray for aboutlessness. Okay. I am going to just see quickly if there's any questions here, and then I'm going to sign off. I'm going a little longer than I usually do. I think that's about, so I just say, if you wrote the poems, they are yours, and that's what binds the book together. So write crazy things and throw them all together and call it a book, and we can have a revolution of miscellaneity. I do have a question here. Hey, Brian Panhausen, what a guy. Cover art by Tara's book is cover art. Tara as a Party did the cover art for Nancy Dembowski's book of poetry. I can't quite remember, but I feel like there was a little head on a pole. Anyway, thank you, Brian Campbell, who loves my enthusiasm. I was going to answer this question by Kate, and then I got to sign off. Kate says, how did you first come across the work of your favorite poets when you were young? I often feel like I'd be a better poet if I'd found my way to the good stuff sooner. Kate Southern is probably the most well-read poet. Kate did a couple of books of fiction and then got into poetry a little later, maybe in her late 30s or something, and has produced several chapbooks and one book, another one coming out soon from Book Hug. But she dove into poetry in ways I've never seen anyone do. I went to an alternative school in North York, up near Shepherd and Finch in Toronto, with Mark Laba, and didn't have to go to classes much. So we'd go to the library up a little north there. It was the North York Central Library, it was called at the time. And we just went to the shelf of poetry and what's this? And I found A Night and Dried Plums by Dave McFadden. That was really exciting. And then I was in a used bookstore, Village Bookstore, maybe in downtown Toronto, and I found a book called Toujours L'amour by Ron Padgett. So it was really just a matter of picking books off the shelf almost randomly, things that had weird titles, and just finding poets whose voices were, to me, conversational, weird. And I loved it. But I got into poetry when I was 10, 11, 12, and my brother Barry was an influence there because he went to university, introduced me to John Donne's poetry. Imagine that I got excited about like a dead 16th century poet when I was 12, 13 years old. But a little before that, I'd found E. Cummings' poetry. When I was about 5 or 6, my dad brought home this big reel-to-reel tape recorder, and my mom got this anthology of poetry that she had, and we all took turns reading, like Charge of the Light Brigade and Annabelle Lee and stuff, into this reel-to-reel tape recorder. I think I was 5 or 6 years old at the time, and that was my introduction to poetry, and I was pretty hooked. So, anyway, that's answer your question, Kate. I'm gonna sign off because I don't want to overstay my welcome. This has made me feel so much better today. It's been a really tough day, and I really appreciate seeing you all here. And I want you all to take care of yourselves. And I'm gonna be back here next Thursday at 7:15. And wear masks and don't touch your face and distance because this thing's not over. So everyone, take care of yourselves. Thank you so much for joining me here in Razovskyville. And thanks. Take care.